Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia daf Sadi, Bava Metzia 90. But we're going to start on the bottom of 89b. The last line, the Gemara is discussing the interplay, the crossover between two topics. One is the idea that a worker is allowed to eat from the food while they're eating. And at the same time, there's also a prohibition against muzzling an animal while it's threshing with tachsum shorbatisho. You're not allowed to muzzle the animal while it's working. And there are certain limitations on that prohibition, as our Gemara is going to discuss. So Tanu Rabbanan paros hamarachsos betvua. So if there are cows, or marachsos betvua, Rashi says this means that after the barley is harvested and basically processed, at that point they would soak the barley in water and dry it in an oven. And then after they did that, then the cows would trample on it in order to remove the outer bran from it. And that is considered to be what's called merachsos bitvua. So this is an unusual step, and it's really after the main process of work has been done. And so therefore, the prohibition of muzzling an animal during this step of the process doesn't apply. And also, va'adashos petruma, also on top of Tzadi Amid Aleph, also if a cow is threshing on the truma and meiser, then what's going on here, Rashi says, is that a person went, and before it was finished, the cow was trampling on it while it was still on its stalks. And so therefore, since it was not yet processed, you might have thought that the prohibition of L'tachsum Shorbadisha applies, that you're not allowed to muzzle, you're not allowed to muzzle such an animal. However, as we're going to learn, the prohibition of truma and meiser doesn't. The prohibition of L'tachsum Shorbadisha doesn't apply to truma and meiser. And so therefore, in these cases, Eino over Mishum Bal Tachsum, it doesn't apply. What's the reason? Rashi says the reason why you're allowed to muzzle your animal in these circumstances is because it's unusual. Because Rashi says the Stam Dayish, most trampling doesn't apply to Truma Meiser, because usually the Truma Meiser only took effect after the Miruach, after it was piled up in a bundle. But Tosos rejects that answer, and Tosos says that the reason why it doesn't apply is because it's not your disho, Tachsum Shor B'disho. It's not your grain, it's Truma Meiser, and so therefore it doesn't apply. However, back to the Gemara, it says, Eino over Mishum Bal Tachsum, but because we're concerned about the appearance of the eye, meaning to say somebody else might see what you're doing and think that you're allowed to muzzle the animal. And so therefore, what we don't allow you to do it, but rather what we do is maybe bull. You have to bring a fistful, may also amin. You have to bring a fistful of that type of grain that you're doing. And then and you hang it from like a bag on its mouth, and it could eat that. We're going to learn later on in our sugya that in general, even though you're not allowed to muzzle the animal, if under certain circumstances, you're allowed to put the food in a bag and have the animals eat straight from the bag and not from the ground. So that's what you could do in this case, because you don't want people to think that in general you're allowed to muzzle an animal. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Yochai says, Mevi karshinim ve toa la. Rabbi Shimon Yochai says, it doesn't have to be from that same type of substance, but it could be karshinim. Karshinim is like this type of food that the animals eat, which is very good for it. And so it's like this vetch that you bring these karshinim and you put it around its neck so it can eat it. Karshinim yafos laminakol, because karshinim are the best thing for it. So the Gemara now challenges this brisa. Again, the brisa we just said had stated The brisa that we just cited, it stated that when it comes to Truma Meiser, the prohibition of L'tachsom Shorvadisho doesn't apply. That you're allowed to muzzle the animal if it's threshing the Truma food, Truma Meiser food. There are many, but we have a contradictory source because it says Paros and Merachsos Eno over Mishum Bal Tachsom. Okay, that's the same. There are cows who are being Merachsos with their crops. You're not in violation of Bal Tachsom. Dashos Betrumo Meiser over Mishum Bal Tachsom. Straight out, explicit. If it's being dash on Truma Meiser, then it is in violation of Baal Tachsom. And that we're going to have to explain this contradiction. But first, we finish the brisa. If the Nachri, if the non-Jew is using the cow of the Jew, he's not going to be in violation of Baal Tachsom. Meaning the Jew is not in violation if the non-Jew uses his cow. But if a Jew uses the cow of the non-Jew over Mishum Bal Tachsom, he is in violation. We're going to come back to those latter statements, but first we have to deal with this contradiction because Kasha Truma, in the first price, it says you're not in violation if you muzzle the animal while it's being dash on the Truma, and Kasha Truma, and Kasha Meiser, and we also have a contradiction about Meiser. Because in the second price, it says that you're in violation on Truma and Meiser if you muzzle the animal. So the Gemara says, Truma, Bishlama, Truma Okasha. It's not difficult the fact that there's a contradiction about Truma. Why? When the Brisa says that you're allowed to muzzle the animal, that's by actual Truma. When the Brisa says you're not allowed to muzzle the animal, that's by Gidui Truma, where you took some Truma and you planted it in the ground. So therefore, under those circumstances, you're not going to be allowed to muzzle the animal because that's only rabbinic truma, and so therefore you'd be in violation of the biblical prohibition of muzzling an animal. And so therefore we don't. If it's just gidui truma, we don't allow you to muzzle the animal. Meiser kasha. But what about the contradiction about meiser? Meiser nami kasha. Kam meiser, kam b'meiser, kam b'gidui meiser. If you want to give the same answer, that one is by meiser, one's by gidui meiser. But that answer doesn't work by meiser. Why? Bishlam gidui truma. It makes sense to say that something that grows from the ground has going to be truma. Elagidu is rabbinic truma, and that's why you would call it that, and that's why you have to say it's prohibited by Tachsom Shorvadisho. But Elagiduim Meiser Chuaninu. But Giduim Meiser, nobody calls something that grows from Meiser to be Meiser. It's called completely Chuan. It's not even called Meiser. How so? The Tanam, we learned in the Mishnah, Gidui Tevel, but Gidui Meiser. Let's say you take some Meiser and plant it, or you take some Tevel and you plant it. Then we're going to say, Gidui Tevel, Gidui Meiser, Sheni are Chuan. So therefore we say straight out that they're Chuan, El Kasha. So the Gemara says, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? Haba Meiser Rishon, Haba Meiser Sheni. So the first answer the Gemara gives is, one is by Meiser Rishon and one is by Meiser Sheni, meaning to say that when it comes to Meiser Rishon, we're going to say that, look at Tosos. Tafil Rabbi Yehuda, when it comes to Meiser Rishon, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says the Meiser Sheni belongs to Mammon Hedjud, it doesn't belong to the temple. You're not going to be in violation if it's outside of Jerusalem, and so therefore we're going to say that when it comes to the regular meiser, it's going to be called disho. It's going to be called your threshing place. So therefore, when we say that the meiser is going to be prohibited to muzzle the animal, that's talking about the meiser of Meiser Rishon. And so therefore, under those circumstances, since Meiser Rishon is allowed to be eaten by the non-Kohen, we're going to say it's called disho. But when it comes to the Meiser Sheni, even outside Jerusalem, since biblically speaking, not allowed to eat it. So even though Rabbi Yehuda says it's Meiser Hedjo, it's your money, it's your Meiser, since biblically speaking, you're not going to be allowed to eat it. It's not going to be called disho, and so therefore you're going to be allowed to muzzle the animal. So by Meiser, regular Meiser, even though it has to be given to the Levi, it's not prohibited to a non-Kohen to eat. And so therefore it's going to be prohibited because it's called D-show. And so therefore you can't muzzle the animal. Meiser Sheni, you could because it's not yours. It has to be in Jerusalem. So that's the first answer of the Gemara. That perhaps it's both a Meiser Sheni, well, Kasha, and it's not difficult because Harabi Meir Damar Meiser Mamagavoho, a position that says that you're allowed to muzzle it, that's by Rabbi Meir, who says it belongs to the temple. That's because he says it's mamagavo, and therefore, for example, as we saw in Kedushin, you wouldn't be able to use it to betroth a woman. And the position it says not allowed is Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's your own money, and so therefore you would be theoretically allowed to betroth a woman with it, and so therefore it's not going to be considered. It's your money, and so therefore you're not allowed to muzzle with it. So the Gemara says, but let's ask a general question. Hey Chidami, how can we ever have this case where you're muzzling an animal when it's Truma Meiser? Truma Meiser usually takes place after it's a finished product. And in that case, at that point, the prohibition doesn't apply. The Gemara says, no, could go and shake Dimu B'Shibon. When you went ahead and took the Truma Meiser, all it's still in its stalks form. The Gemara says, well, Rabbi Yehuda, okay, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's prohibited because it's Meiser Sheni, and so therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it's prohibited, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that Meiser Sheni is the money of the temple, and so therefore you'll be allowed to muzzle because it's not yours. Or Rabbi Yehuda, how could you allow the animal? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not required to muzzle because it's not yours. But we have a different problem that you can't eat the Meiser Sheni or feed it to your animals outside of Jerusalem. Don't we require the walls of Jerusalem? So if it's Meiser Sheni, how could the animal be eating it? So Gemara says, no, it's inside the walls of it's inside the territory of Jerusalem. So therefore it's not going to be a problem. It's another possible answer is that it depends whether or not we're talking about actual certain Meiser. In that case, we're going to say if it's actual certain Meiser, then you would say that there's going to be no prohibition to muzzle the animal because it's certainly Meiser. And the other case is talking about Meiser Demai. Meiser Demai is where the Meiser the food comes from an Ama Aretz, somebody's not careful, and so therefore just being strict to say it's Meiser. And so therefore, for that reason, since we're just being strict to say it's Meiser, it's really still yours, and therefore you'd have to muzzle the animal. And Gemara says, well, if that's the case, once we've come to this answer, Truma nami lokasha. Then we could use the same answer about Truma and say Kama Trumas Vadai, Kama Trumas Demai. One is by actual Truma, and one is by Trumas Demai. We're just not sure if it's Truma. Gemara says, well, Bishlam Meiser Demai Ika. And the Gemara says, no, this concept of Demai by Meiser, it does exist. Ela Trumas Demai, but by Truma, Mi'ika, we don't really have this concept that we have to be concerned that maybe Truma wasn't taken. Vatanya, so the Gemara says, and as the brisa that supports this idea is from the following, because we said, Vatanya, we said, Afu Bito es Havidoi, that Rabbi Yochanan the Kohen Gadol canceled the confession that you recite over your Meiser, and the reason is because there was a Gzera, Ezra made a Gzera that you don't give the Meiser to the Levites anymore. And we said in this Takana that we say in the Vidoy about Meiser, we say, I gave it to the people it's supposed to get it, but you don't give it to the Levite anymore. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol canceled it. The Gazer al Admai, and he made a decree not allowed to eat the food of the Amaret without taking Meiser from it. Because he sent a message to all of Israel. He saw that they're only taking the Truma. So therefore, there's no Truma Stemai, but there is Meiser Tevai. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, we'll give a different answer. So the Brisa that says, after you give the Meiser to the Levi has to take Truma from it. And so we're saying that the Brisa that says that you can muzzle the animal, that refers to Trumas Meiser Vadai. Certainly, it was certainly Trumas Meiser. So therefore, it's not yours because it has to go to the Kohen. But then there's Trumas Meiser Demai, and that we're not sure if the Levite took Truma. The Levite is Amaret. So therefore, under those circumstances, we would say that that's like regular Demai. And so therefore, that's like Meiser Demayan, so therefore you're not allowed to muzzle the animal under those circumstances. So now we have a series of questions about the muzzling. Let's say the animal has GI issues, it can't eat things because it has diarrhea. So it's having diarrhea by eating. So you want to muzzle the animal so it doesn't get sick. What will be the law there? Mishum de malilahu, what's the reason why you're not allowed to muzzle the animal? Is it because we wanted the animal to have food and be better, healthier? And in this case, it doesn't help it. Or maybe the problem is that it sees the food is in distress. And here it sees the food and is in distress. So Amrahu Rav Sheshes Tinisur. Rav Sheshes says we learned this from a brayse. Rav Shimon ben Yochai says maybe karshinim betoila, that you bring the vetch and you hang it around its neck. Karshinim yafas lamanakol, because the karshinim are the best for it. So we see from here Shemamina Mishum Demalila. We see from here that the whole concern is because we wanted to have something good for the animal, and so therefore, if it's unhealthy for the animal, we would be allowed to muzzle it. Next question: can a person say to the non-Jew, "Chasom parasi, I want you to muzzle my cow"? V'doshba, can a person ask the non-Jew to muzzle his cow, his ox for him? Mi amrina, do we say ki amrina amiro nachri? Shvus, do we say that when we say that you're not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do something for you, because that's called a rabbinic prohibition called a shvus? Hani Mili Inyan Shabbos. Maybe that's only on Shabbos you can't ask a non-Jew. The Isser Skila, because there's a prohibition that's so severe on Shabbos that you get stoned if you violate it. Aval Chasima, but by muzzling the animal, the Isser Lav is just a regular prohibition. Maybe the prohibition of asking a non-Jew wouldn't apply. Or maybe it doesn't apply at all. So maybe you'd be allowed to ask the non-Jew. So how do we answer this question? Tashma Nachri Atash Paraso Shal Yisrael Eino Over Mishum. We say that we said in the brayse above that if the non-Jew is dash with the cow of the Jew, then the Jew is not in violation of the prohibition of Bal Tachsum. He's not in violation of he doesn't get lashes. But it would seem to be from the language of the Gemara that you're not allowed to do it. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. But dinu the Isura Namilech. There's also no prohibition. It's only I did Tani Seifa the Israel Adash Paraso Shal Nachri over Tana Reisha ain't over. Just because the concluding clause says that the Jew who uses the cow of the non-Jew is in violation of Mutal. So therefore, in the first clause, it uses that language, but it's not dispositive. Toshma. What about the next attempt? The Shochle Lavud the Shmuel, how on Tori de Ganavim. Those oxen were on the top of 90b of the robbers, of the Aramean robbers, Umeganchen Yason, and then they castrate the bulls. What would be the law? Mahu. So what was going on here is that the Jews had these bulls, and the bulls were apparently only really productive workers when they were castrated. And so the Jews had these very good non-Jewish friends who would take the bulls and castrate them. They would steal the bulls from the Jews, quote unquote, steal the bulls, meaning to say the Jews wanted them to castrate. The Jews wanted them to steal it. So they would steal the bulls, castrate them, and then return them to the Jews. So they sent the message to the father of Shmuel, is this okay? He said, oh, they're trying to use a legal fiction, arama, trying to evade the law. So we're going to do something to them. We're going to force them to sell it. So we see that you're not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do it for you. So Amar Papa B'nei Ma'arava Savi Rabbi Chitka. And he said, no, this case, the reason why he was very strict is because that question came from the land of Israel, and they actually say it's not just asking a non-Jew to do something for you, that the non-Jews had a specific prohibition against castrating an animal. Because they all, like Rabbi Chidko said, B'nei Noach Mitzuvin al Asirus, that this is actually, in addition to the 7 Noahide laws, Rabbi Chidko said this is an 8th law that the non-Jews have to obey, that they're not allowed to castrate the animals. And so therefore, by giving it to the non-Jew, you're causing him to violate, you're causing him to sin, and therefore you're in violation of your own prohibition, which is the prohibition that you can't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And we see from here that this applies. So then the Gemara says, Sava Rava Meimar Yimachru L'Shlita. So Rava thought when Shmuel's father said to sell it means sell it at a deep loss. He means just sell it as to be slaughtered, even though this animal was a worker animal and not to be slaughtered. So he thought that that's what you'd have to do. So Amalei Abaye, no, Dayan Shekinas Mechira. it's enough that they have to sell it, but they don't have to sell it to be slaughtered. They could just sell it to be another working animal. Now, Gemara says, Pshita, beno gadol ki achardam. It's obviously the case if he sold it, he could just sell it to his adult son, because that's somebody else. But beno katamai, can he sell it to his minor child? So Rav Achi also, Rav Achi said he can, Rav Ashi Shari. Rashi said, it's allowed Marim or Marzutra, Vamilu, Hani Tre Chasidim, Mechalfi Adadi. So this is an astonishing statement to the Gemara. It says, Marim or Marzutra, and these two pious Hasidim, these two pious people, they used to basically, it sounds from the Gemara that they would allow their non-Jewish friends to steal it, and then they would be forced to sell it, so they'd sell it to each other. Tosfos can't accept that. Tosfos says that they were actually stealing it without their knowledge. It's not that there was a wink, but they really stole because these were pious people, and so and they didn't want people to think that that it happened without their knowledge, and so therefore they traded with each other. So basically to prevent chashad, to prevent people from suspecting them. But the upshot of this is the Gemara doesn't directly answer the question of whether or not Amiro and Nachri, whether or not when it comes to a non-Shabbos prohibition, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to violate the Torah on your behalf, and the Torah doesn't directly address it. So it's a big dispute amongst the Rishonim, the medieval authorities, and the Ramah rules that we have to be strict here. The Ramah rules that you're not allowed to give it to a non-Jew and ask a non-Jew to do something. This, of course, raises a major question. If a Jew is a pet owner, how are they able to spay their animals? So we'll leave that for another time, but I just want to warn everybody who's listening to this that is not a simple question by any means. Can you put a thorn in the animal's mouth? Means say, okay, you can't muzzle, but what about putting a thorn in the animal's mouth? So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? If you put a thorn there, that's actually muzzling the animal. What's the difference if you call it a muzzle or a thorn? No, let's say it has a thorn in the mouth. Do you have to take it out? And then the Gemara says, here, before the Gemara answers the question, ask another question. Here, if you put a lion outside, if you put a lion outside where the animal is working, so it's too afraid to eat, mahu, what will be the case there? Gemara says, here, that's actually muzzling it if you put the lion there. So no, we're talking about a case where the lion is crouching there, and therefore the animal is too afraid to eat. What would be the law? Mahu. Or hamid benami, do you have to remove the animal? Hamid benami b'chutz. Let's say you put the mother's baby outside, and so therefore the mother is unable to eat. Mahu. Let's say it's thirsty. What will be the law? Parasla katpila gabedisha mahu. Well, let's say you spread a leather cloth over the food so it can't see what it's working on, and so therefore it doesn't eat it. So what would be the case there? Pasha miyachad. The Gemara says at least we can answer one of them. The Tanya Rashai Bal Paro Lahari of Parosa Kadesh Shetochom and Adisha Harbe. That the owner, before he rents out his cow, is able to basically starve it for a day, so that when it comes to work on the guy's field, it'll eat all of his field. I mean, it's not prohibited. It might be. It sounds a little like slimy, but it's not prohibited. Rashai Bal Abayis Lahatir Pakia Amir Lefnei Abehema Kadesh Lo Tochom and Adisha. Harbe. And you're also allowed to open up like a big haystack so it eats the hay, so it doesn't eat any of the grade A crops. But anyway, we see from here that this is like Rashi says, like spreading out the piece of leather on top of it because you're covering up the main food. So the Gemara says, no, that case is totally different. Shani Asam Dika'acha, because that case is different because there you're feeding it. You're not just covering up the food, you're feeding it with a different food. So Gemara says, Ibai Sema, alternatively, we say Rashai Baal Abayas Lahati Pekia Amir of Nea Be'ema Meikara. Another answer is no, when it says that you can give it hay, it means give it hay beforehand so it's full when it shows up so it doesn't eat the grade A grain. Rabbi Yonasami Rabbi Simai. Rabbi Yonasan challenges Rabbi Simai. He says, let's say that you were chosim the animal, you muzzle the animal outside the threshing place. Means say you did it back in your home and then it traveled to where it needs to go. So you didn't actively thresh it at that place when it was disho. Ma'u shor v'disho amarachmana. Well, this is not a case of disho, so maybe it should be permitted because you muzzled it prior to its working. Or maybe the Torah is saying just that it's just not allowed to work while it's muzzled. It's not that you are prohibited. You can't allow a muzzled cow to work. So the Gemara says, Amalei, that Rabbi Stimai said back to Rabbi Yonasan, mi beis avich atawame. Let's learn it out from your father's home. You're a Kohen. And what does it say? It says, Yain v'shechar al teish atov v'necha itcha bevoachem hu da'aser. Basically, it says you can't drink wine, you and your children, when you come in to the temple. So the Gemara asks the question, bevoachem hu da'aser, mishta Mile Shari, meaning it's only prohibited. Obviously, it's not the case when you're walking into the temple, but if you're drunk when you go in, it's permitted. The Torah says the whole purpose is that you can't serve while you're drunk. You have to separate between the sacred and the profane. So that's exactly the case. That just like over there, you can't be drunk when you come in. So to here, you can start to work with the muzzle on the animal. So then Gemara says, and we'll bring a proof for this. Let's say a person muzzles the animal, but his friend is the one who is touched with it, or he just does one part of it. And the person who ties the ox and the donkey together, which is, if they'd made it, be the prohibition of kalayim, but he didn't actually plow with them. His friend is the one who did it. Potter, in those cases, he doesn't get lashes. He's only going to get the lashes if he does both of these things together. And so therefore, we see from here that the main prohibition is on an animal that is actually muzzled, and that's the essential prohibition. So we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.